Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Crispin Freeman B06. Initiate Part 2.
Okay, well that was fantastic, but I'm going to try to bring it back to Young Justice a little bit.
Young what? Young who? Young where?
There was this show you might have heard of.
Oh.
So tying this into storytelling, when I said, would you be interested in coming on the show? And you said, yeah. Yeah, I think you said you'd listened to us a couple of episodes and said, I want to rewatch the entire series. And I was really impressed by that because it felt like this thing I'm going to talk about in a minute about you guys as cast members being interested in this show as seemingly as much as the fans were. You were like, you know what? No, I want to give this, no pun intended, justice, and I'm going to rewatch both seasons before I come on. So how was that experience for you? Now that we have a grasp of like how you are looking at things from the storytelling perspective, how is rewatching Young Justice now, this many years later, with maybe more experience behind you in the storytelling front and a little bit of distance?
Yeah, well, to be perfectly frank, I'm not sure I ever watched all of Young Justice complete because we were doing it so piecemeal, right? And because there was such a long gap between when we would record an episode and when it would be released. And sometimes I would miss an episode here or there. And so I had a general, in fact, I missed the fact that Guardian wasn't me later in the second season. We were literally in the recording session and I saw Guardian's lines and I assumed it was me again. I didn't realize that it was going to be a different actor.
That it was Matt.
Yeah, I didn't know.
That's so funny.
And so we're halfway through the recording session and they're like, we're going to swap out some actors. You can go out and take a break and we're going to bring these other actors in. I was like, but I have to do Guardian. Like, no, you're not Guardian anymore. Because I hadn't seen, the episodes hadn't been released yet.
Yeah.
And I wasn't in a bunch of episodes, so I didn't know what had happened to the Guardian character. And so I was just coming in doing my part. And so I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not Guardian anymore. Oh, it's somebody else. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Could have warned me, so I didn't look like an idiot, but that's okay. I'm not Guardian anymore. All right, somebody else is Guardian. Great. So for me, again, I'm in the kitchen. I'm making this stuff. I don't know what it looks like out there on the table yet.
Right,
and it's hard for me sometimes to get out there and see it until it's all done. Right. And so when it was all done, but it had been a while, I was like, okay, but let me watch it the way the audience watches it, which is from the beginning, with no breaks, with no confusion, with no trying to figure out what's going on. And let me just go through the whole thing so I can talk intelligently about the characters and the arcs of things. Because that's why I was willing to come on your podcast, is because when I listened to your podcast, your agenda was one of a creator.
Yeah.
Early on in my career, I saw a comic book artist from Japan say, creators and consumers just don't think differently, they think oppositely. And the phrase that I like to use is Stanislavski's phrase of love the art in yourself more than yourself in the art. So a creator loves the art in themselves, and they try to bring that art out to contribute to whatever piece they're working on, you know? But a consumer tends to love themselves in the art. That's why they cosplay. That's why they dress up as the characters, is because they just want to luxuriate in the art. But often they doubt that they have any art of themselves to contribute. So this is a sort of 180 turn in your psychological stance about how you're going to approach something. And so I wanted to just watch it from the consumer standpoint so that when I came on here with you, we could talk about it from a creator's position. And that's why I was enthusiastic about coming on your podcast, is because clearly you were coming from loving the art in yourself. What do you have of your own that you can contribute to art, to storytelling, that might be able to make cool art? And so that's why I wanted to come on and chat.
Oh, thanks so much. I take that as a huge compliment. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So could you let yourself go? Like, was there enough time that you could kind of, I forgot about that storyline, and I don't remember even saying that line, or that kind of stuff? Like, it sounds like you knew that Guardian was a clone of Roy right from the get-go, which is something that most of us didn't find out until at least later in season 1, if not season 2, and then having to rewatch it a second time to catch that Double X refers to Guardian as brother in that very first episode, the same way that he refers to Superboy as brother in that very first episode.
Brother. Yes, of course.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, so amazing.
So you have to understand that I wasn't always told everything.
Okay.
Usually questions would be answered when I would throw up an objection. And not an objection like I'm pulling the handbrake, but more like, I'm confused and I don't know how to give you the best performance. Can I have a little more information? Right? And so
Right, sure.
one of the things that obviously we as voice actors are often called on to do is to play many different characters. And often voice actors pride themselves on being able to differentiate their voice from character to character so it doesn't just sound like the same thing over and over again. That was not what I could do. Because every time I got a new character that was a Roy, I was told, not the guard. Like the guards, I could do a different voice. But if I had a Roy, they would say, yeah, don't change it that much. Well, they're going to think I'm a bad voice actor. Yeah, but you're a clone. And I'm like, but they're going to think I'm a bad voice actor. Yeah, but you're a clone. And I'm like, is everything I do a clone? And they're like, pretty much, yeah. And what? So from the beginning, it was roughly explained to me, well before the scene where Guardian explains it himself, that the first Guardian was a clone of Roy.
Right.
But, and we can go, I'm sure this is a question you were probably going to ask anyway, I did not know I was the mole. Okay?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah, so
interesting.
As I'm moving forward as Speedy, and I'm, Red Arrow, thank you very much. As I'm moving forward as Red Arrow, and I'm all, angry and emo about everything, they keep talking about the mole, and my character says there is no mole, right? And so I go, okay, great. And then we get to episode 25 of 26, and the end of the episode, it says, I'm the mole. I'm literally at home reading the script going, I am? No! Ridiculous! Right? Fortunately, they had given us episode 26 as well. It's rare. Usually they only give us one episode to read, but this time I'd had both 25 and 26 to read before I went into record. So I was like, what? Page turn, go to 26, and I start reading through it, and I realize, oh my God, I am the mole. I have been the mole the whole show, and nobody told me.
Wow.
And so I go into the record the next day, and I'm just shooting daggers at Greg Wiseman. I'm like, Greg, why didn't you tell me I was the mole? And he's like, well, we didn't want to affect your performance. And I'm like, Greg, I'm not the audience. I'm your co-creator. Let a brother know what's going on here, right? Because then I would have understood when we were planting seeds that would pay off later, right? Then I can help you plant those seeds effectively. Do you distrust me as an actor so much that you think I'm going to send up my character and make it so obvious that I'm the mole from very early on? No, I'm a better actor than that. Come on. But if you let me know, then I can put little subtle things in there. Like when Sportsmaster looks up and sees, he says there's a mole, and then he looks straight at Red Arrow.
Right.
And I mean, that's a visual cue. I have no control over that. But there are nuances in the way that I could do performances or say things that could leave a trail of breadcrumbs that you could pick up on a second viewing. And instead, I mean, they did that anyway, but they did that without me consciously knowing. And I was like, I would have loved to have been a part of that process consciously. But there you go.
Yeah, well, there was so many of those things when you go back and, of course, rewatch it again. But the broken arrow scene with Red Arrow and Sportsmaster and Cheshire on the rooftop.
Yeah.
Where he says Red Arrow, and then they cut away, and then they cut back, and Roy looks like he's waking up.
Yeah.
He's holding his head and he's dizzy or something. And it's something you don't pay attention to. And then he looks up, and Cheshire's just standing there casually and waving at him like, did you forget we were here? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't know what happened. I don't know what this is. And then, it moves on. And then at the very end, you realize, oh no, the broken arrow was the keyword, right? They did a lot of that stuff visually, which, I mean, I feel like I've watched a lot of animation, but clearly you're an animation expert in the room, at least. So do you see, this is something that I don't see in animation a lot. And Caleb and I talk about this a lot on the show, is that the animators and the directors and Greg and Brandon and whoever are getting together saying, no, I want this character in the background of scene 47 to have his eyebrow go up at the 40-second mark. There's so many visual things happening with all the characters in a room that when you go back and read the body language, you can see what's happening with these characters. Is that something that you see in animation, or is this fairly unique to Young Justice?
I think this is part of Greg's artistic ethos, which is Greg has always approached animated storytelling as if it is just as rich and visually nuanced and storytelling sophisticated as any live action storytelling. It's a shame that we have to put it that way. But what that really means is that you plan out the story ahead of time. You know where you're going, right?
Yeah.
So that you set up these premises and these things so that they will pay off later. And you can see that as early as Gargoyles, right? That they sort of knew where they were going and they know how to handle that. So when you're laying that kind of really solid foundational stuff, then you don't paint yourself into a corner and have to retcon things because you knew where you were going and you're just going to set everything up and knock it down. And that's one of the things, in addition to many other aspects of Greg, that I admire so much, is that he thinks about it that way. I mean, you have to understand, when I first came on to Young Justice, and we were doing the first episode with Cadmus and the G clones and the C clones and the STWV clones, and I was like, this is all garbage, right? This is what, he's just making this up. A quick trip on Wikipedia, and I find out, nope, this is canon. This is totally there. And I go, see, this is what Greg does. He researches the cosmology of the world to make sure that it's consistent. Now, when it happens in other shows, oftentimes it's accidental. For instance, if you go back and you watch the animated Superman series from the 90s, I believe it's the Bruce Timm-inspired one, right? After Batman had been so popular. And if you watch the first episode, and the whole premise is that Jor-El thinks Krypton's going to explode. That's canon, right? But it turns out there's a computer on Krypton called Brainiac, which runs everything. And so there's a council of elders, and when Jor-El says to the elders, like he always has in all the old Superman mythology, hey, Krypton's going to explode, the elders don't believe him because they turn to the Krypton computer, Brainiac, and say, Brainiac, is he right? And Brainiac, which is smarter than anyone on Krypton, says, no, he's completely wrong. He doesn't understand. And so the elders go, Jor-El, you're wrong. Goodbye. Later, Jor-El comes back and finds that Brainiac, the Kryptonian computer, which is supposed to serve the planet, is uploading all this information to a satellite in orbit. And Jor-El says, why are you doing this, Brainiac? And Brainiac says, well, because you're right, Jor-El. But there's no time to evacuate the planet, so I'm saving as much of Kryptonian culture as I can. Now, this is a computer making an ethical decision with no heart. Right? It's saying the data is more important than the people. And so Jor-El goes, damn you, launches Kal-El into space to save him. Brainiac launches his satellite into space. Krypton explodes. And now you have two opponents. You have Superman and Brainiac against each other, both children of Krypton.
Yeah.
Now, it's amazing. Right? It's a really wonderful setup. And I'm not aware that it's ever been done quite that way before in the Superman mythology. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody can point me to a comic book where it happened.
No, I'm pretty sure that that's the first time, and it is a drop of gold.
Right?
For sure.
So go listen to the DVDs and turn on the commentary track of all the guys who are creating Superman. All right, creating the TV series.
Okay.
And when you listen to them talking about this episode, one of them turns to the other ones and say, hey, guys, you know, this Brainiac thing, I'm not sure this has ever been done before. Do you think this is some sort of commentary on technology and our relationship to technology and how things work? Beat. Nah, we just thought it was cool. We just thought we'd put it in there.
Oh my God.
So this is the challenge. Greg is much more of a conscious creator. He is making sure that this is going to say what he wants it and thinks it should say. I was so happy with Electro in Spider-Man because they told me Electro's not just electrified, the electricity is coursing through his brain and giving him shock treatment. It's driving him insane. And I went, oh, that is the coolest idea for Electro I've ever heard. Oh, let's roll, right? And so that's why my Electro is like so, like a hurricane when he starts losing his mind. He's so unstable. And I'm like, oh, that's so good, right? And so that's, when it happens, it's usually because there's a conscious creator somewhere, whether it's Greg, Miyazaki can be this kind of conscious creator where he sets stuff up and knocks stuff down. And all the best TV series are set up this way. When they're not, you get lost, where they don't know where they're going. And by the end, it's really unsatisfying because the story has no meaning. In order for a story to have meaning, it must have an end. And when you have somebody like Frank Miller who writes Dark Knight Returns, he puts an end to the mythology which gives meaning to all of Bruce Wayne's life. And so when you have a story that doesn't have a proper ending, it doesn't have any meaning. You can't glean from it wisdom. It was just entertainment, you know?
Yeah, no, I hear you. This is maybe a bit of an odd parallel, but in my day life, I'm a hospice nurse. So I was an ICU nurse, and now I do home hospice visits for patients who want to be in their home with their families that pass away. And a lot of people have been telling me since I started this position that, oh, that must be so hard. And I say, there's a really interesting parallel to writing. I don't know what their life story is. I don't know what it's been. I don't know how they perceive their life story. I don't know how their families perceive their life story. My job is to make their last chapter for them and for their family the best chapter I can possibly provide. And it's because when you read a mediocre book with a great ending, you're probably going to recommend that book. It's an okay book, but the ending is awesome. If you read a really good book and the last 100 pages are terrible, you're not going to recommend that book, right? And it's kind of the same in what I look at when I'm doing my job, which is let's do this so that your family can carry on with an ending chapter that they can look back on positively. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's incredibly noble of you. And those people are fortunate to have someone who has the kind of wisdom that you have in approaching that, right? That is your agenda.
That's kind of you, but the job is not difficult for me. It's one of those jobs where you just all the keys come together to do the job. I hope the best job that I can. Sorry, that was a bit of an aside, but I think it was fairly applicable. The idea that so in watching, to pull back Young Justice for a second, this thing you're talking about, having to retcon or this stumbling on things or this, almost role-playing game-like situation where you're like, oh, remember that thing we did in that first game 6 months ago? Oh, let's pretend that was planted and made sense in this final scene, right? Mm-hmm. In Young Justice, I was watching it the first time with that mentality. I was convinced that in Image, which is like in the 20s, episode in the 20s where they finally reveal the secret behind Miss Martian, I thought that was a retcon. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm so glad they heard that we were all really annoyed by this stereotypical 70s teen girl character that I didn't care for. I'm so glad they fixed this in a really interesting way. I started a podcast to keep apologizing to Greg for this mentality I had about it. Because then I went back, of course, and watched it a second time. And the first time I see there's the episode Downtime, Artemis is sitting in her living room and she's cleaning her arrows and doing some work on her gear. And in the background on the TV, there's the thing that says, next up on Comedy Central or whatever, another episode of Hello. And then the TV shuts off because her mom comes in to talk to her. And my brain exploded that I was like, wait a minute, what? And then there's another scene. I think Uncle Dudley is in his apartment and it's also playing in the background. And then I saw the flashback. There's a scene where McGann gives Superboy his memories back in Bereft, where they show an image of her in her white Martian form, and she's in a cheerleader outfit saying, hello, Megan, but we've never seen her like that. And all of these things made me realize, oh my God, something else is happening here. This is not what I expected at all. Mm-hmm. And even now, after having watched it so many times, and Caleb and I both, as we're researching an episode, we're like, oh my God, man, you don't even know what I just found out that I didn't realize the first 30 freaking times I've seen this series. The whole Calderon's name being like a rephrasing of Cal Durham, who is a character from the 70s. This is like stuff that most creators would not pay any attention to. Who cares what his name is, right? But instead, it's his dad, and his dad is a character that existed in the 70s, who was an ally of Aquaman, who was tied to Black Manta, it's just like, and it's an ensemble cast. It's not just, it's hard enough to do this in a show like Arrow, which is, theoretically focused on a single character, right? With a few supporting cast characters. Every character has equal weight in everything that they're doing through all of these episodes. I want to understand how his brain works. Greg's brain. To put this kind of thing together. And you got it behind the scenes, sort of, except he didn't tell you things.
It was on a need-to-know basis. The problem is I really needed to know. Apparently. He didn't tell me.
Apparently. So what other things did you notice this watching through? Were there any surprises?
As you can imagine, obviously I'm looking a lot through the lens of Red Arrow. And it was really great to see the visual cues about him that there was no way for me to be able to see when we're recording the script, right? Because, people say, oh, you're a Red Arrow. It's like, yeah, well, I'm like half of Red Arrow. The other half is the guy who animated him, right? Or the guy who character designed him. So I think that was probably the most satisfying thing for me, was to see all the visual cues in the storytelling that would bring things together. And also that I could get more into the relationships between Miss Martian and Superboy and Artemis and Wally, because I'm not there for those scenes. So I wasn't in the room when they were recording those. So without and I would get snippets, right? Because I might read a script where that scene is in it, but I'm not going to be in the room when they're recording it, or I may be, or I may not, who knows, depending on actor schedules. But it's nice to have the through line of it all instead of just getting it piecemeal. It's like, instead of just getting an issue here and there, I'm starting from the beginning and I'm never missing an issue. And the visual storytelling was very satisfying. I'm always looking at villains because that's usually the weak link in storytelling, because people don't quite know how to make the villain work. And so it was really wonderful to watch the light and how their plans were working and how it would unfold. And it's always very satisfying to watch plans unfold, and also to have broken expectations where you think the heroes have thwarted the light's plans, and then they say, oh no, that was exactly the way we wanted it to go. And you say, well, that's easy for you to say, but no, then it turns out they're right, and because it pays off later in the plot where it was exactly the way they wanted it to go. And I go, yeah, thank you. That's when I feel like I'm in good hands, that the storytellers are not going to drop me on my head with something like midichlorians that come out of left field and completely, adulterate the meaning of what's going on. So that was really satisfying. I thought the ensemble aspect of it was pretty cool. The only thing is that when they went into the second season for Invasion, I wished we hadn't just dropped the first team so hard. I do love the stuff they're doing with Blue Beetle and all the new characters, but it meant that the relationship between Miss Martian and Superboy was basically put on hold. We've taken a season to get to know these characters really well. We want to see them continue. And for them basically to be in a sort of holding pattern is like, oh, but well, then what happens next, So that was the only thing. But I love me some Blue Beetle and everything that's going on there. So I was like, okay, I'll watch Blue Beetle and see what's happening, and Arsenal and all that good stuff.
Right.
Of course, when I first got cast as Red Arrow, as Speedy, I came in the first day and I was like, so do I get to be a heroin junkie? And they looked at me and they went, no, we can't do the hair. I'm like, no track marks on my arm? Damn. Okay. Do I get to have an illegitimate child? No, we have to write it so that you married Cheshire and you're just separated. I was like, oh, damn. You're taking all the fun out, Greg.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
From a mythology standpoint, looking at Young Justice, the way that you analyze these other movies that we dove into, what I'm assuming is going to be the last episode of our interview, did you look at Young Justice from this kind of mythological perspective and see anything particularly interesting? Is it things that you've noticed in Greg's work in the past, or kind of what larger stories are being told differently than they normally are told in American animation?
Well, see, the thing is that mythology influences storytelling. But not every piece of storytelling has a metaphysical or mythological aspect to it.
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah, of course.
So the mythology of Britain certainly influences something like Doctor Who.
Right,
but
of course.
The Doctor is sort of anti-mythology. He's anti-supernatural. He always has a scientific or historical explanation for why something is happening. Same with Star Trek. Star Trek really does not like the mystical, especially when you go into something like Deep Space Nine, where they do not want to call them wormhole aliens. Or, no, sorry, they don't want to call them the prophets.
They want to call them
right?
wormhole aliens, yeah.
Star Trek says, no, they're wormhole aliens. And everyone on the planet says, no, there are prophets. They are our spiritual guides. And Sisko, as a captain, has to keep doing this ping pong between, am I the prophet or am I just an officer, a secular officer of Starfleet? Right? So Star Trek and Doctor Who, these are not mythologically oriented stories, even though they are clearly influenced by the mythology of America and Britain. Mm-hmm. So when I look at Young Justice, what I see is that, like most American superheroes, it is greatly influenced by both Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian notions of heroism, right? So that the Justice League looks a lot like a Greek pantheon.
Right.
And they all wear their names on their chest, but they don't act like the Greek gods. They're not shagging and cheating and, trying to do all the crazy stuff that Greek gods do. They're fighting for justice, which is a very Judeo-Christian notion of how the universe should be organized. That the universe must conform to a notion of justice or else it is fallen. It is broken in some way. So that is absolutely at play in the influence of how superheroes are put together. But I never got the sense that Greg was trying to make any sort of metaphysical comment on the world through Young Justice, right? As opposed to Gargoyles, where the heroes are literally mythological creatures. And so the idea that these gargoyles look demonic but are actually protecting. And there's a big argument that Goliath has in the Gargoyles about, we protect the castle, which is sort of an old medieval notion of cosmology. There is an in-group, which is in the castle, and those are the people we love, and people outside of the castle are the out-group, and we don't like them. But then when you take that medieval cosmology and you transport it to modern-day Manhattan, it's going to cause major problems, because now Goliath is going to defend the castle, but Xanatos, who is a pretty shady character, owns the castle. So now he is pledging fealty to a bad lord.
Right.
What was good medieval ethics back then is now bad. And so there is an episode where he goes, no, it's not the castle. We can let go of the castle. It is this island, Manhattan. That is what we protect. And you go, aha, right? Now that's interesting. And then they have the whole world tour with the Mists of Avalon and the whole notion of King Arthur and Griff, who is like one of my favorite gargoyles ever. He's so sporty and British. I'm on my way, sir, And so then you have this notion that there are metaphysical forces at play that have ethical consequences. And who are you going to pledge your fealty to? Are you going to say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and follow Demona down the path of whatever with Macbeth and everything else that's really negative, although it kept her alive? So do you fault her really for it, right? Demona probably would have died had she not made this deal and survived. But Goliath has to say, I love her, but I don't know if I can get on board with this.
Yeah.
It's similar quandaries that happen in Lord of the Rings, where you go, Gollum deserves death. And Gandalf says, yes, there are people who deserve death. There are also people who deserve life who die. Can you give them life? Then don't be so eager to deal out death in the name of justice. He may have a part to play in this when all is said and done. And over again in Lord of the Rings, if a character chooses mercy over good tactics, they are rewarded. It makes no sense for Aragorn to chase after Merry and Pippin after they've been abducted by the orcs. The Ring of Power is going straight into Mordor. You should probably help Frodo if you want to save the world, right? But two little hobbits versus the world, you go to save the hobbits out of a notion of mercy, he is rewarded. When they are on the steps of Mount Doom and Gollum is literally trying to kill Frodo and Samwise, they won't kill Gollum. It doesn't make any sense strategically, tactically, but it does if you're working with a Catholic notion of mercy. And so mercy, and Gandalf says this in the second chapter, mercy has ruled the fate of many things. And so these stories are going to try to put forward a cosmological viewpoint of this is how the universe works. And if you want to be in alignment with the laws of the universe, this is how you need to behave as a hero. This is the spiritual and physical lessons you need to learn. I'm not sure I see that so much in Young Justice, right? Most of the stuff that's happening in Young Justice is more ethical than mythological. Do I take these shield packs from Lex Luthor to give me the powers that I want, or do I not? And the question then becomes, have I betrayed my friends? Not, have I put the universe in danger, right?
Yes.
Or the planet or Middle Earth in danger. So there's no metaphysical thing at stake. Or have I put my immortal soul in danger? That's when you're working on that metaphysical level. And to be perfectly frank, even though the DC universe has all of these Greek gods running around with names on their chest, it doesn't really want to deal with the metaphysical very much. You have to go to Marvel with Doctor Strange and Ghost Rider before you start getting metaphysical demons and things. You know,
Right.
I mean, you could make an argument for the new gods, which do show up, and you could say, well, there's New Genesis and Apocalypse and this thing there. And I go, yes, that's classic biblical cosmic dualism and everything else. But they have very little impact on Young Justice, right? We're not actually doing battle with Darkseid and the forces of Apocalypse and having questions about that. You know, that's very much tangential to the main thrust of the world of Young Justice.
Right. Except we may end up seeing that in a later season, though, as of the end of season 2. So
Hey, it may come up, and he may take it in a more metaphysical direction than it has been in the past. And I would not put that past him. That could totally be the case. I have no idea what they're going to do, and I won't know, and I probably won't know I'm the mole again. You know, who knows? I'll find out I'm the Buddha, having been reborn over multiple... I have no idea. We've been cloning the Buddha. You are the Dalai Lama. We've been cloning you to keep track of... I have no idea. So yeah, I don't see a huge metaphysical bent to Young Justice. It is mostly personal, sociological, and ethical. Do you go to Rimbor and put yourself under this law court? Is that the ethical thing to do or not?
Right.
That's different from saying, I'm going to trust the Force to help me destroy the Death Star, or I'm going to have faith in mercy to help me defeat the Dark Lord Sauron, you know?
Right. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. My brain is like running like catch up with the stuff that you're throwing out, and I'm loving every minute of it. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I want to dive into a few questions, because right now we are getting into, I could talk about this for days, but Neal would kill me on the editing. So let's move into some of the fan questions that we have. It's a bit of fans, friends of the show, and actually some of our own team members as well. So one of the first things that jumped out, and this came up from a few different people, our friends over at the Young Justice Wiki had talked about, because there were 3 Roy Harpers with different personalities. You kind of touched on this a little bit. How did you approach that? Like, especially when you had scenes like the intervention in season 2, we put that as a quote outtake at the beginning of this episode, where Guardian and Roy are having this conversation. You had said that they told you use the same voice, right? But James D'Amato was asking maybe if did you let the emotional state of the character kind of guide the differences if they're in the same scene together? Like, how did you approach that?
Sure. I think often it is a common understanding that what voice actors do is they change the sound of their voice to differentiate characters. It's not enough, though. That can be a trap, right? Because what really differentiates characters is their psychology and their motivations. That's really what's going to make characters feel different from each other. And so even us professionals, sometimes we can get caught up in worrying about making sure that our characters sound different. And we can sometimes forget to do the psychological acting work to make sure that they're differentiated from each other. Many times because we're working with very little time and almost no script, right? So cut us a little slack. We're doing our best. But it was interesting because as an actor trying to do my good job and make everybody happy, I started to fall into that trap. I've got to make them sound really different from each other. And then they took that away from me. And I went, oh, right. If I'm a good actor, I should make them sound different from each other psychologically. And out of those psychological differences will come the vocal differences. Right? Doing it more from the inside out than from the outside in. Both ways can work. I've created characters both ways. I've created a voice and then filled that with a psychology, and I've created a psychology and then found the voice for that psychology. I was doing the inside out for these characters because I realized they were not going to be differentiated for the audience vocally as much as I thought they might be, so they had to be really different psychologically. Yeah. And that if I stayed very true to the psychology of those characters, then my delivery would sound different. It would have a different tonality, even if I wasn't putting on an accent or aging my voice or doing any technical trickery, right? So it's a very transparent way of differentiating characters. And it's actually something I learned from anime because often I was cast as similar types of characters in anime over and over again, but I didn't want them to sound the same. And in anime, you can't put on a Daffy Duck voice to differentiate the character. It has to sound more cinematic. And so I realized if I'm going to play a lot of dark brooding characters as I do in anime, each one has to be very psychologically different. And I do a lot of research on my characters in anime to make sure of that. I even stayed up all night before a recording session and watched an entire show, Witch Hunter Robin, in order to find out the motivation of my character, because I couldn't just glean it. Usually I can just look at a character after a couple of episodes and I know what they're doing because I've seen enough of The Matrix that I go blonde, brunette, redhead, like it makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
This one in Witch Hunter Robin, I couldn't figure it out because it wasn't about a girl and it wasn't about his dad, and I couldn't figure it out. And it turns out it's about his mom. Like he has mother issues. And I was like, oh, totally didn't get that. But now that I know that, I can make him work properly. And they used my lines for him as the promo trailers on Cartoon Network because they rang so true because I had figured out his psychology. So that was my goal with Guardian, with Roy Harper. And I assume we're talking about Roy as Arsenal as opposed to Red Arrow, right?
Right.
Or, because it's hard. That's how I because Roy as Arsenal is ostensibly the original Roy. And so Red Arrow, do we call him Roy? I don't know, so maybe we should just call him Guardian, Red Arrow, and Arsenal. But when we were doing them, it was the psychology, because clearly Arsenal has a big axe to grind about stuff. He is righteously indignant about things, whereas Red Arrow is guilty. He has this deep notion of guilt of not only having betrayed his team members, but also been this thing that screwed up Arsenal's life.
Yeah.
So Arsenal's looking for vengeance, Red Arrow is looking for redemption or forgiveness, and Guardian is the big brother character who's just trying to do what's right, which is also a character I've played a lot. So there's this notion of when he takes over Cadmus, we're going to do this properly, we're going to be ethical, we're going to be right, because I don't think that Guardian, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody can tell me in the continuity, I don't think Guardian has had the personal trauma that Red Arrow and Arsenal have had.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Yeah.
He's trying to follow the rules. He's like a good Cyclops. He's trying to do his best to make sure to follow the rules and make sure everything works. That's very different from these wounded characters who have real personal axes to grind.
Right. No, that's fascinating. Well, that pretty much well answers that question. Our next question's from Emily Buza, who's a friend of the show, and she's very big into mythology and fairy tales as well. And she says, with mythology, there are certain myths and legends that are regularly alluded to in fiction. She says Hercules, Icarus, Pandora all come to mind as common references in modern fiction. Are there any particular myths that you feel are underrated or overlooked that have great symbolic storytelling potential for the modern age?
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, my scholarship is not necessarily about illusions. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is really important work. It's like library science. Let's make a chart or a glossary that explains, okay, this references that and this references that, and I love those because they help me map things. My job as a scholar is not to catalog, even though that is a valuable skill. My job or my goal is not to catalog all this stuff, but rather to show how they influence the storytelling so that you can see patterns, right? Cataloging is different from pattern recognition. So when I see that there are 5 Power Rangers, and the 5 Power Rangers for the last 35, 40 years have always been the same archetypes: the hero, the rebel, the fat guy, the kid, and the girl. And it doesn't matter how far back you go, all the way back to 1972 with Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, which was Battle of the Planets here in America.
Battle of the Planets.
Battle of the Planets, Voltus 5, Combatler V, the original Lion, Voltron Go Lion. You go back to all these, it is always the hero, the rebel, the fat guy, the kid, and the girl. Okay, what is going on? Right? That's not about alluding to Icarus, right? That's programming. That's low on the brainstem programming, and I have got to figure out why it's happening, right? And it turns out that there's very good mythological reasons for why it is happening. So I'm not in the business of cataloging, although I always appreciate it. But in terms of mythologies that are overlooked that could influence storytelling, it happens all the time, especially because in Western culture, we tend to get locked into an Abrahamic or biblical notion of storytelling. And so when someone reaches outside of that into a different area, it can be really fascinating. I think of what could we do with sci-fi and voodoo, right? Now, part of this has already been done in some cyberpunk. It's either the sort of William Gibson world or the Neal Stephenson world, where they talk about Eshu Legbara, the law of the pathways, and this notion of using voodoo mythology as a metaphor for interconnectivity on a net. And also, I love what Neal Stephenson did in Snow Crash with this idea of low-level programming and Sumerian language as a way of low-level programming of the human brain.
Oh, interesting.
So that the Sumerians may not have had massive architecture, but they had a lot of data that survived, whereas the Babylonians had architecture, but not as much writing. And so he plays with this idea in Snow Crash that you could rewrite the programming levels of your brain using linguistics. So I think that there are always things that could be influential, but there's no point in doing it in just a sort of ad hoc exoticism notion. Because then you get into Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where they reference Hinduism and the Thuggee cult, but it's just exoticism, right? They're not actually exploring Hinduism. It doesn't have the same resonance as Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade when you're dealing with the Holy Grail. Now they're dealing with the mythology seriously. The mythology in Temple of Doom is just for the titillation of the exotic nature of this world, and it's not honestly exploring what's going on there. So I would never want someone to just throw in some mythological references because that's cool. That's actually, not only is it sort of culturally appropriation and disrespectful, but it leads to bad storytelling. It means that you haven't actually incorporated what's useful about that into the story so that it works, dudes.
Right, yeah. Take a minute, stop and think.
There's got to be, and it was Tolkien's criticism of C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis was not a Christian. He converted to Christianity. Unfortunately, in Tolkien's mind, he converted to Anglican Christianity rather than Catholicism, much to Tolkien's chagrin. But that was Tolkien's criticism of Narnia, which was it was chop suey. Lewis would just throw in mythological characters from all over the place. So you'd have Minotaurs, and you'd have Santa Claus, and you'd be like, whoa. Wait, there's no consistency to this world. There's no overarching cosmology that's consistent. And on top of that, it's alluding, right? It's an allegory. It's not a metaphor. A metaphor can be read in many different ways, so that when Lord of the Rings came out right after 9/11, people saw it as a metaphor for the battle against terrorism. When it came out as a book in the 50s, they saw it as a metaphor for World War II. You can reread Lord of the Rings and apply it to different situations. That's not really the case with Narnia. Aslan is Jesus, full stop.
Right.
He cannot be Zoroaster. Right? He cannot be Moses. He cannot be Muhammad. He can't be anybody. He has to be Jesus. And when you do that, you have, in Tolkien's mind, taken freedom away from the reader. You are fascistically dictating to the reader how they must interpret your story. And Tolkien thought that was controlling. And so that's the danger of alluding to things without doing the homework that you need to make sure that the world works consistently. It was a revelation to me how Catholic Tolkien was. I had no knowledge of that. I was raised in a very secular environment, frankly. All of my study of religion is like an anthropologist. I'm coming from the outside going, how do you do this?
Right.
But later in life, when I started researching Tolkien and realized how much of his Catholicism influenced his life and his writing, I thought, well, that's interesting, because when I read Lord of the Rings as a young kid, I thought it was Taoist. Because the idea was, if you destroy the evil ring, the good rings go away too. So in my world, this was a balanced universe where there must be equal parts of yin and yang.
Yeah, I see that.
Right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until later that someone pointed out to me that even though it looks like Beowulf, no one talks like Beowulf. Beowulf kills monsters. He loves doing it. Nothing can stop him. Gandalf keeps saying, stop killing. This is not Beowulf, even though all of Rohan is Anglo-Saxon and is Beowulfian, right?
Right.
Just like the Justice League. They look like Greek gods, but they don't act like them. They act Abrahamically. The stuff in Lord of the Rings looks very Anglo-Saxon and pagan, but the value system is pro-life. And so I go, oh, look at that. I didn't even get that. And isn't that great? That I could look at it as a Taoist parable and only later go back and understand its Catholic roots.
Interesting.
That's brilliant world building.
Yeah. Again, with my long pause as I'm catching up with you. Yeah, that's amazing. I love it. And I hope that answers Emily's question to an extent.
I have been guilty that people say, don't ask Crispin a question unless you really want to know the answer.
Oh, yeah. I've had that myself.
I apologize if I start to turn into a bit of a fire hose.
No, not at all. And this is one of the reasons why we have our discussion sessions and don't try and fold these into regular episodes. with guests, because really what we're trying to do is get your passion out here. I mean, that's what we want to know. I want to know you. I mean, we can look at your resume. That's great. I mean, that's wonderful. But I want to know what's going on in your head. Why are you, not just who are you, you know?
Well, I appreciate that greatly.
Yeah. So our next question comes from Kat Cool, who is the GM and the host of the Star Wars Actual Play Campaign podcast. Kat had mentioned that she has followed a lot of your discussions on myth, specifically in relation to Star Wars, which is not hugely surprising. But she's asked, I'd love to know how your take on religion and mythology as presented in Episode 7 and Rogue One maybe influence your past talks, how your past talks might evolve, or if you saw anything, I'm assuming, new or interesting in Episode 7 and Rogue One.
Sure. I had a friend who said, I liked Episode 7 when it was called Episode 4.
Right.
Because unfortunately, the structure of Episode 7 is so close to Episode 4 that, to me, Episode 7 feels like the greatest hits of 4, 5, and 6.
Right.
And so I understand why they did that. They're trying to reboot the series and make sure they can bring everybody in, and they want to hit all those things that everyone loves about Star Wars.
Right.
I think it took Luke 3 movies before he could do things like move things with his mind or do Jedi mind tricks. And then Rey, she can do it like instantly. And that's a little problematic. So here's what I think. I think that they haven't decided yet. We haven't had a mentor figure to explain to the characters how this stuff works.
Okay.
We had a mentor in Episode 4. Right?
The
Force is an energy field that binds us, it connects us, it binds the galaxy together, right? And so that's basically all we get is this sort of quasi-Taoist explanation of the Force. But then we get Empire, where we get much more detailed theology of what the Force is and how it works. And then we see it in practice in Jedi, where he decides not to fight, right? We see that. It hasn't been articulated yet. I can't tell from 7 whether they're going to go 4, 5, 6 and hew to Taoist Zen Buddhism, or whether they're gonna try to keep the Abrahamic biblical midichlorian stuff from 1, 2, 3.
Right. That makes sense.
I don't think they know yet, because J.J. Abrams is a great filmmaker, but he doesn't always understand cosmology so well.
Okay.
Case in point, in Star Trek, when he rebooted Star Trek, his complaint about Star Trek was that it was too slow and too boring. Well, guess what? He made Star Trek breathless. I am not going to criticize him for making Star Trek incredibly exciting. But he sort of slid over the fact that what makes Star Trek is a commitment to science and a commitment to skeptical inquiry. And he sort of threw a lot of that out of the window. Now, one of the things he did in the first reboot of Star Trek, and this is where I mistrust sometimes his metaphysical knowledge because I'm not sure he has enough to really redress it. In Star Trek, we have this problem where Kirk gets ejected out of the Enterprise onto that ice planet, and he runs into Spock Prime. And then he runs into Scotty, and then the two of them get back on the ship, and then the story, what are the chances that would happen, right? It starts to really strain credulity that would be the case. Well, they were aware of that. When they were writing the script, I heard this in an interview, said, we had this problem. We thought, God, this is weird. But that's because they had an idea that the universe was trying to heal itself. The idea is that Nero had punched through the space-time continuum with his time travel, with his crazy, humble mining ship that can destroy anything. That's another problem. But anyway, so he punches through the space-time continuum with his time travel and causes chaos, right? He's disrupted the space-time continuum, and we're on an alternate timeline now.
Right.
The idea was initially that the universe, like antibodies, was setting up highly improbable coincidences in order to repair itself. So the reason why Kirk gets dropped on this planet and just happens to bump into not one but 2 people he needs to make things better is because, like platelets trying to coagulate and close a wound, the universe is trying to repair itself. What a fascinating cosmology, right? That the universe has some level of consciousness and that it is a living being that now we must interact with in some way, or we're a part of it, or maybe we're a cell, or maybe we can relate to it as a separate being. Like there's all sorts of possibilities that open up that you could play with. And they went,
Right.
yeah, but that's silly. We just cut it. Okay, see, that's a problem because you can throw out that metaphysical cosmology and keep it secular, right? And say, nope, there's no metaphysical, it's just empirical secularism. Fine. But you left that plot point in which doesn't line up in secular empiricism.
Right.
So you left this vestigial organ that came from a different cosmology. You got to do an appendicitis. You got to remove the appendix, dude. It doesn't work. You've got to find another solution that lines up with a secular empirical cosmology, not a metaphysical cosmology.
Right.
And I go, ugh. Right? So when you ask me, what is JJ going to do with the metaphysics of Star Wars? And I go, look, George couldn't figure out the metaphysics of Star Wars.
Right.
I believe that someone else could. I'm not sure JJ is the man. We'll see. There is more reference to it in Rogue One with our blind monk and the Kyber crystals.
Right.
But again, it's just references. And there's this part of me that goes, if he's so one with the Force, why does he need to martyr himself? Right? Luke doesn't have to martyr himself. Luke only martyrs himself when his choice is either spiritual death or physical death. And that's usually the difference between a mythological hero and a tragic hero. Any metaphysical hero is usually faced at some point in the story with either a choice between are you willing to physically die or spiritually die? And always the hero, if they are wise, will say, I would rather physically die than spiritually die.
Right.
Now, if the hero chooses that and lives, he's Luke Skywalker, right? He destroys the Death Star and he survives. If the hero chooses that and dies, then he's Hamlet. Or he's some other tragic hero who says, this is the way to die. If I am going to die, this is the way I do it. And in a way, that's what Frodo does. He says, I am willing to die to save the world. And even though he survives, his survival is a half-life. And that's why he eventually goes to Valinor on the gray ships to die. He doesn't go to Valinor on the gray ships from the Haven to live in bliss for the rest of his life. Tolkien says that any mortal that goes to the Blessed Lands is so overwhelmed by the bliss that they die. So he's going to die, just blissfully. That is the way to die. So with Rogue One, I see the blind monk dying, but it's not clear that his death, it seems trivial. I mean, I realize that everyone there is, spoilers, everyone there is going to die in order to get the plans out to save others. So I guess he's one cog in the wheel, and I guess you could argue that. But it felt trivial. And even more trivial was his friend with the huge backpack gun, who just seemed to go out without a blaze of glory. I was like, at least go out in a blaze of glory, right? Very different from something like the second Aliens film, with the Space Marines fighting the aliens on LV-426 with Ripley. And there's that wonderful shot when Vasquez and Gorman are trapped.
Yeah.
And they both put their hands on the grenade. And Vasquez turns to Gorman and says, you always were an, forgive me for swearing on your podcast, but you always were an a-hole, right? And you go, oh.
So good.
Not only is that a wonderful sacrifice, there's no other choice. I feel with the blind guy there was another choice. I feel like there was another way that could have been solved. Right? So it feels a little cheap. With Gorman and Vasquez trapped in that air duct with the aliens closing in, there's no other choice. And so they go out in a blaze of glory, and not only do they die heroically, but you get a character reconciliation between them because they hated each other.
Yes, absolutely. They could become peers in that one moment.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've resolved it not only metaphysically, but psychologically as well. Oh, that's so good.
I know. Gives you a rush, right?
That's so good.
So maybe I'll expand this question out then. Then what about if we include, say, Rebels?
I haven't watched enough of Rebels.
Okay. Now that's a fair answer. I was curious as to whether your animation thing may have taken you in that direction since Star Wars is part of your discussions. But I mean, they dive a little deeper in some aspects because they had the time.
Yeah.
Of course.
And I've only seen like a couple of the beginning episodes of Rebels, and it sure looked that way. You're absolutely right. It looks like they're really going to play with the spiritual notion of the Jedi in a much clearer way. And so hopefully they do, but it's my fault. I haven't watched Rebels to be able to tell you where they're going with that.
Yeah. I'm totally blaming you for not watching Rebels. But I would say I want them, I will say they do try to do some things, but I'm not sure I'm wrapping my entire brain around how clear it still might be. We'll see, I guess. Maybe I need someone else who to look at it and maybe put the through line together. I know it gets discussed a lot.
Here's the problem. If the revelation has to be explained, it's not a revelation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
no, I hear you.
When I watched the first Matrix movie, I came out of the film and I was just gobsmacked. And my friend who was with me, a classmate of mine from grad school, said, "You really liked it, huh?" I was like, "Oh my God, that was amazing." And she turned to me and goes, "It's the special effects, right?" And I looked at her and I said, "I could give two craps about the special effects. That's the best modern retelling of the Buddha I have ever seen."
Yeah.
And she went, What? Now,
yeah.
You don't have to know anything about Gnostic Christianity, the Gospel of Thomas, or the Buddha Dharma in order to appreciate the first Matrix movie. You will get it. You will get the spiritual message without any bibliography. That's good storytelling. The problem is, in the second one, you have to know something about Hinduism. You have to know something about a famous story called the Humbling of Indra in order to understand that final confrontation between Neal and the architect, that this is lifted from a very popular story in Hinduism. But if you don't know that, it makes no sense. That's bad storytelling. So if you're telling me you're watching Rebels and you can't figure out the spiritual message, that's bad storytelling.
Yeah, I don't know if I can't figure it out or if I just haven't, because I'm getting it week by week and it's kind of bits and pieces. And of course, it's folded in with me doing other things in my life. I'm not sure if it's just that I haven't, like if I watched it all in a row and then like really put a bit of my brain power focused on that particular aspect of it, that it wouldn't like, oh, right, that's what they were doing. But in some cases I am, in their defense, my defense, I don't know. I'm watching it sometimes while I'm doing other things with the kids or, you know, that kind of thing. So,
oh, of course. And I forget that, you know, I have this lens of mythology that is so finely tuned that other people don't have that. So, and I'm not saying that Rebels is a badly written show, right?
No, not at all.
It can be a fantastic, it doesn't have to necessarily have any deep metaphysical meaning. But if it's there, you know, it'll hit me in the face in ways that other people will just have a feeling about it.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. And Greg was involved in the first season, which was my favorite season so far. There's been really good stuff, but we're getting on a bit of an aside there, but I guess that is kind of attached to Kat's question. Anything else you want to wrap up about Star Wars and mythology and these new incarnations of Star Wars?
Yeah, I would love to see what goes on. I mean, I did like Rogue One. I thought Rogue One was more compelling than Episode 7. It's not that Episode 7 was necessarily, it wasn't bad, but it was serviceable. It was not inspiring. I thought Rogue One was an interesting take on things because it's basically a suicide mission. And so the question is it's the notion that Tolkien talks about, the notion of northern courage. What do you do in the face of impending doom? Do you despair or do you fight until you can't fight anymore? And this is a very Viking notion of heroism. You know, Ragnarok, as the world is coming apart, do you give up or do you keep fighting until the last blow? And so I think Rogue One works on that notion of, you know, how do these characters deal with the notion of a suicide mission? Part of me almost wishes that was more clear, right? They knew they were going into danger. I think it would have been nice once they left Yavin if it was clear that they knew they were not coming back and that they were making the conscious decision to say, we're not coming back from this, and yet we still choose it because this is the way to die. Then now we're into tragic hero land. Right. And that's when you get catharsis, right? That when they talk about catharsis in Greek tragedy, it's that separation of being tied to the mundane. And you go, no, that is the way to go, right? That's the catharsis.
Right. Okay, so our final question comes from Neal, who is the editor for our show. He asks, is there anything that you haven't tackled yet in your voice acting career that you want to do? Certain type of character or a situation or storytelling mythology, possibly?
Wow, that's an interesting question.
Is there something you're not doing that you want to be doing? And why aren't you doing it, Crispin?
Why am I not doing it, Crispin? God, get on with that. Make a show. Well, let me put it this way. I am different from most voice actors because, as you can probably tell from my verbal diarrhea here, I get obsessed with the story more than any individual character. Most actors would say, there are these types of characters that I haven't played yet that I want to play. And when Nicolas Cage does that and tries to be an action hero, we go, guys, that wasn't a good idea. So I am not that. I am quite happy playing the types of characters that suit my voice the best. And sometimes I get to range out into things that I never thought I would play, and that's great. But to me, if I play a really quirky character in a bad show, it's very unsatisfying. I would much rather play a small character in a really good show, right? That's why when they cast me as Red Arrow in Young Justice, I said, oh, yeah, no, thank you, right? Because other actors might say, I want to be Superboy. You know, he's a bigger character. He's a bigger part. And I want to do that. Or I want to be Superman because he's more iconic. And I'm like, no, Nolan should be that. I should be Red Arrow. That's perfect for me. You know, that's the best contribution I can give to this show is as Red Arrow. Thank you, Greg, for having the wisdom to put me right there. You know, good casting.
Nice.
So usually when you ask me that kind of character, what runs through my brain is, what kind of stories have I not seen that I would like to contribute to be a part of? And frankly, this takes me back to Suntop. I would love to see a shamanistic character, right? Someone who is a shaman who has possibly a female knight. So this happens in William Gibson's Neuromancer, where you have Case, who is the hacker, and Molly, who's the razor girl.
Right.
And so he's the technological shaman, he's the cracker, and she's the one who dices and slices people.
Right.
And that's what Wendy Pini did with her characters. In ElfQuest, the main character is Cutter, who is a barbarian elf, but he's very wise. He's not harsh. He's a good, noble leader, but he's a sword swinger. And then he meets Lita, who is this desert elf who has healing powers. She has magical powers. This is your traditional dragon slayer and magic user, right? The dragon slayer's male, the magic user's female. Then when they have children who are now biracial, which is really cool, right? She switches the gender roles. So now Ember, the young girl, is the tomboy who acts like her father and is going to be the leader of the Wolf Riders. And the young boy, Suntop, is the shaman. Now this also happens in Native American storytelling, where you have two leaders of the tribe. You have Killer of Enemies, who is the chieftain, and Child of the Waters, who is the shaman. Both are necessary to keep the tribe healthy. We also see it in anime storytelling. It's the red Oni, blue Oni thing, where you have Maverick and Iceman, right? Where you Killer of Enemies, Child of the Waters. And so I have always gravitated towards the Child of the Waters, towards the shaman character. When I was younger, I used to sort of identify with Legolas. As I've gotten older and I consider myself more of a lore master, I feel more like Elrond. And so that sort of notion of spiritual power would be awesome. Right now, we frankly need more women. I want to see more Scarlet Witches, right?
Yeah.
That scene
for sure.
in the Avengers film where Hawkeye gives her the pep talk and then she storms out of that room and just starts taking people out left and right with her magical powers. That, we need more of that, right?
Yeah.
Joss Whedon has done it in Buffy and in Firefly with a woman who can kick physical butt, right? With Buffy and with River. But we don't see it enough with spiritual power. When I saw Scarlet Witch came out, I was like, oh, thank God. A woman who can have magical power and kick butt, thank you. So we need more of that right now to balance some of the storytelling scales. But eventually, I would love to get to the point where we could have the spiritual hero who is a guy who can be that and is admired and isn't just thought that he's weak, ineffectual, fey, that can be as equally as powerful as the sword swinger. And then have a female knight. That would be pretty cool.
That sounds fantastic to me. I had a really stupid grin on my face when you were talking about Ember and Suntop because I just realized that's the description of my children.
And do you know that Wendy was approached, I believe in the 80s, to make an animated series of ElfQuest?
I'm well aware. I have the old original magazine-sized black and whites of ElfQuest where they talk about it in like, oh, we're in talks and we're doing all this stuff. But that was in 84, 83.
Do you know what one of the reasons why it did not go through?
No, I don't.
They wanted to switch Ember and Suntop. They said, look, this is really cool, but Suntop has to be the Dragon Slayer and Ember has to be the magical girl, just like Cutter and Lita. And she said,
my God, that
no,
makes me
that's
so mad.
That's not how the story works. And so they said, well, then we can't make the show. And Wendy said, well, screw you.
Yeah.
My story is more important than your getting commercial advertising. Sorry.
I don't even know what to say to that. It makes me furious.
This is why my brain went to Japan to watch a lot of storytelling.
Fair enough. All right. Thanks so much for spending time with us in the cave, Crispin. Where can people find you out here on Earth Prime?
Sure. Well, obviously you can go to crispinfreeman.com, which is my voice acting website, and it has my demos and whatnot. But on there are links to my two main websites, one about my voice acting mastery podcast, which is at voiceactingmastery.com. I've been running the podcast now 6 years? 6 years? It's been a while. I have to remember what year it started. I think 2011. Yeah, I think it started in 2011. And so if you're interested in pursuing a professional career in voice acting, you can go to voiceactingmastery.com and download all, at this point, 122 episodes of the podcast. There's also a sister podcast that I started a little more than a year ago called the Voice Acting Mastery Field Report with young voice actors who are just starting in their careers because the challenges they're facing are very different from the challenges I faced 20 years ago. And so I always want to keep the information relevant, and so they're doing some really great work. So check out both the main podcast and the Field Report, the sister podcast, really good information about what it takes to work as a professional voice actor. And then obviously my mythology scholarship there's a link there on crispinfreeman.com to mythology and meaning.com. That's why I called it that, is because it's the meaning that is, for me, the most vital thing. It's the only reason for me to unpack all of this stuff technically or structurally is to have a deeper understanding of the meaning of why we tell these stories over and over again. So crispinfreeman.com, voiceactingmastery.com, and mythologyandmeaning.com. Those tend to be the triumvirate of websites where my information is dispensed.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks to everyone for sharing some time with us. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at www.facebook.com/crashingthemode, and on our website, www.crashingthemode.com. If you aren't already a Crispin Freeman fan from his 2 decades of voice work, I'm hoping this opened your eyes to the range of his talents. If you were already a fan of his work, I hope this discussion sends you to both the Mythology and Meaning website and Crispin's in-person speaking events. If you're an aspiring or professional voice actor, as he just mentioned, and want to learn more, I cannot recommend Voice Acting Mastery enough. Of course, its high production quality and content are what you might expect, but for me, not being a voice actor, the interviews with industry people like Phil Lamar dive deeper into the ups and downs that's relative to any creative career. If you want more Young Justice, the fastest way to get it is to #buy comics on Comixology.com and encourage everyone you know to do so as well. Buying the comics digitally shows DC that we want more of the things that you love. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star review. The ratings really do help the show. If you'd like to support the show and getting more reviews, discussions, and interviews such as this, then please consider linking over to www.patreon.com/crashingthemode and pledging a few dollars a month. As a thank you, we're offering access to our episode outlines, Young Justice-inspired role-playing game adventures, in-depth articles on subjects we've only touched on in the show, a free copy of the Masks RPG from Magpie Games, and more. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced, please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.